Christian Spirituality in the Catholic Tradition, Part 17. Chapter 9. Modern Spirituality. The period covered under the heading Modern Spirituality extends from the 17th to the 19th century, and the focal point is France. While it is true that modern spirituality retains something of an effective flavor for the teachings of St. Francis de Sales, except for Italy, the Salesian influence has not been predominant. Rather, the spirituality fashioned by the French school was eminently Christocentric, firmly rooted in the Christology of St. Paul and the theology of St. Augustine. We would have expected that period to produce some masterpieces in theology, says Florand. But when we list Chardin's Cross of Jesus, the Sermons of Bossuet, the Meditations of Malebranche, we have practically named them all. The Tendencies of Pascal are but a woodpile in disorder. Nevertheless, the Christocentric spirituality of the French school was diffused so widely that for all practical purposes, Catholic spirituality in modern times could be characterized as French spirituality. This is especially evident when we consider the vast influence of French culture and religion on other countries throughout the world, particularly during the 18th and 19th century. In order to evaluate the strength and the weakness of orthodoxy and the distortions of the French school of spirituality, it will be necessary to retrace our steps somewhat in order to investigate its origins and trace its development. Sources of French spirituality. France in the 16th century was a scene of intense religious activity, directed principally against the Protestants, but life within the Church was anything but fervent. The regulations of the Council of Trent were in large part a dead letter. The king was absolute sovereign of all religious holdings. Bishops were worldly, priests were ignorant and immoral, and religious life was at a low ebb. Reaction against the Protestants was practically the only restraint and the only unifying factor. The first move towards actual reform of the life of the Church must be credited to the Capuchins, who came to France in 1573, the Carmelite nuns, who induced Spanish spiritual teaching through Anna of Jesus, the Jesuits, established in France in 1553, the professors at the Sorbonne, and the Carthusians. The Capuchin, Benedict Canfield, 1562 to 1610, is of special importance as a forerunner of the French school of spirituality. His treatise, Règles de Perfection, went through 25 editions and was translated into all the European languages, into Latin as well. If the theme of the work is necessary of death to self and total abandonment to God, the source of his doctrine are impressive. Pseudo-Dionysius, Herp, Saint Bonaventure, Hugh of Balma, Alphonsus of Madrid, the institutions of Pseudo-Tauler, Ruysbroek, Theologica Germanica, Blosius, St. Catherine of Genoa, the Cloud of Unknowing, and Walter Hilton. Another Capuchin, Joseph Tremblay, 1577 to 1638, wrote Introduction à la vie spirituelle par une facile méthodique d'orison, which is an adaptation of the Ignatian exercises to the Francis of spirit and usage. Tremblay was known as the Grey Eminence because he became attached to the household of Cardinal Richelieu in 1613. However, the French school of spirituality starts with Bérulle. Though he was influenced to some extent by what is called abstract school of Benedict Canfield, Dom Beaucousin, the Carthusian, and a few Capuchins of mystical tendencies. Only relatively recently has it been possible to study Peter de Rule in any degree of objectivity and calmness. During his lifetime, 1575 to 1629, he aroused the hostility of the Carmelites, the Jesuits, and Cardinal Richelieu. Through the centuries since his death, authors have tended either to exaggerate his originality, Bremond, or to classify him as a poor transmitter of Ignatian spirituality, Potter. From his earliest years, Bérulle was drawn to God and divine things. He took his early studies under the Jesuits, made the exercise to determine his vocation, then studied at the Sorbonne, and was eventually ordained a diocesan priest. He knew St. Francis de Sales, who spoke highly of Bérulle, and was instrumental in bringing the Carmelite nuns from Spain to France. He also became their spiritual director. As regards his spiritual doctrine, he had read the works of St. Francis de Sales, St. Ignatius, and St. Teresa of Avila on his knees, but he was specially devoted to the study of St. Augustine and the Fathers of the Church. He was also influenced at first by Herp and Ruysbroek, but in systematic theology he followed the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. Some authors find traces of the teaching of St. Gertrude and Ludolf the Carthusian in Bérulle's doctrine, so far as it is Christocentric. The first work published by Bérulle was Brief Discours de l'Abnégation intérieure, Paris, 1597, and it reveals that at this early period Bérulle was thinking along the lines of the abstract school. Possibly it was a French adaptation of an Italian treatise composed by Isabella Bellinzaga, assisted by the Jesuit Achille Gagliardi, Breve Compendo di la Perfezione. As the title indicates, Bérulle treats of the abnegation necessary for total adherence to God. The first, a low estimate of all created things and of oneself above all, acquired by the frequent thought of their baseness, and by the daily experience of one's nothingness and infirmity. The second is a very high ideal of God, not by a deep insight into the attributes of the divinity, which was not necessary, which few gave, but by total submission to self, to God, in order to adore him and give him all power over us and what is ours, without reserving any personal interests. Several events in the life of Bérulle weaned him from the abstract school and emphasis on self-abnegation. He turned to a spiritual doctrine based on the positive commitment or adherence to Christ. First of all, in 1602, the Carthusian Beaucousin translated into French the Perla Evangelica by an unknown Dutch author. Since Beaucousin was Bérulle's spiritual director at the time, it is certain that Bérulle was familiar with this treatise. In fact, in his Trois Discours de Controversie, 1609, Berulle uses the same words, style, and doctrine as found in the Perla Evangelica. The doctrine, of course, is eminently Christocentric. Secondly, in 1602, Berulle made the Ignatian exercises under the direction of Father Maggio, was powerfully impressed with the self-humiliation of Christ. In thinking of the incarnation of Christ, I weighed deeply and at length in the depth of my soul this sovereign goodness of the eternal Word, who, as very God, is so exalted above all created things. He has indeed deigned to humiliate and abase himself so low as to place on his throne so vile and abject a nature, and was indeed willed to be associated and united therewith so closely that no greater or more intimate union can be found. As the incarnation is the foundation of our salvation, I have weighed most deeply how great ought to be the abjection of self, by which he who resolved to labor for the salvation of his soul must begin, since the Son of God deigned to begin it in this mystery by humiliation and abasement of his divine and eternal person. Thirdly, though his close association with the Carmelite nuns, whom he introduced into France and then served as spiritual director, through his reading of the works of St. Teresa of Avila, he became convinced of the central position of Christ in the spiritual life. It was also at this time that Berulle discovered the works of St. John of Avila and Louis of Lyon, both Christocentric writers. Finally, Berulle's disputes with the Protestants, which caused him to write Trois Discours de Controverse, forced him to go back to patristic sources, where he absorbed Christological doctrine, and then go back to St. Paul and St. John. In this way, the spiritual doctrine of Berulle was gradually elaborated, to be completed by the founding of the Oratory of Jesus, under the patronage of Christ, the sovereign priest. Between 611 and 613, Berulle composed a series of prayers for the use of the members of the Oratory and the Carmelite nuns under his direction. At this time he extended his spiritual doctrine on Christ to include Mary, and from that time on he was separated from the Son, from his mother. And yet, in the entire scheme of his doctrine, his spirituality did not terminate either in Jesus or Mary, but rather Berulle's concept of the journey to perfection was to Christ through Mary and through Christ to the Trinity. Unfortunately, the one thing that was original in Berulle's teaching roused the animosity of the Carmelites, Duval and Gallimont, and ended Berulle's friendship with Madame Acquaint, who had entered Carmel as a lay sister, taking the name of Marie of the Incarnation. It also caused his elevations to be censured by the University of Louvain and the University of Douai. The point at issue is Berulle's vow of slavery to Jesus and Mary. Whether it was due to excessively pessimistic interpretation of St. Paul and St. Augustine, or a reaction to the unwarranted exaltation of human nature and freedom at the hands of the humanists, Berulle looked upon man as the most vile and useless creature of all, indeed as dust and mud in a mass of corruption. Man must therefore wage relentless war against his own misery and sinfulness, and at the same time have a deep conviction of his need for God's grace. He must strive to reach the point of total adherence to God, but this can be done only at the cost of heroic renunciation. This, in turn, revolves around various elements. Only at the cost of heroic self-enunciation. In this, in turn, involves various elements. Voluntary renunciation of all sensible and spiritual consolations in order to give the soul a capacity for grace. A fervent desire to love God with all one's heart, accompanied by a humble prayer or petition to his effect, an opening of one's soul to the operations of incarnate word, at the same time willing whatever Christ wills, and, finally, to maintain the disposition of total self-annihilation before Christ by making a vow of holy slavery to Jesus and Mary. In this way there is nothing left of self, but everything is surrendered to the action of Christ. Berulle had intended his vow of slavery only for those persons of the Oratory and Carmel who were advanced in Christian holiness. But as it became more widely known, it was subjected to attack by the theologians who could see in Berulle's doctrine at least the seeds of Jansenism, Quietism, Lutheranism, or the abstract spirituality of the Low Countries and pseudo-Dionysus, which by this time was completely out of favor. At the urging of his friends, Berulle defended and explained his doctrine in his masterly work, Grandeurs de Jesus. The vow of slavery to Jesus and Mary was no longer presented as an action restricted to those in the higher stages of spiritual life as formerly, but as a logical consequence of the baptismal vows taken by all Christians. To justify his doctrine, Berulle shifted his emphasis from man's renunciation to the servitude of Christ's humanity in the hypostatic union. The human nature of Christ, considered apart from the divinity of his person, is essentially in a state of servitude, and remains in this state permanently and perpetually, with regard to the divinity, by reason of his very nature and condition. If, therefore, we place ourselves in a similar state of slavery in relation to Christ, we shall be able to belong to him completely, and thus share in his very life and grace. Hence the vow of servitude to Christ, composed by Berulle. With this desire I make to thee, O Jesus my Lord, and to thy deified humanity, a humanity truly thine in its deification, and truly mine in its humiliation, sorrows, and sufferings. To thee and to it I make an oblation and entire gift, absolute and irrevocable, of all that I am through thee in being, my nature and the order of grace. I leave myself when wholly to thee, O Jesus, and to thy sacred humanity in the most humble and blinding condition that I know of, the condition and relation of servitude, of which I acknowledge to be due to thy humanity, as much on account of the greatness of the state to which it was raised through the hypostatic union, and also on account of the excess of voluntary abasement to which it became reduced in humbled, foamy salvation and glory in its life, its cross, and in its death. To this end and this homage I set and place my soul, my state and my life, both now and forever, in a state of subjection and the relations of independence and servitude, in regard to thee and to thy humanity, thus deified and thus humiliated together. Because of her exalted dignity as Mother of God, Mary is likewise honored by a vow of holy slavery, which Beroul expresses as follows: I vow and dedicate myself to Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, in the state of perpetual slavery to his most holy Mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary. In perpetual honors of the Mother and the Son, I desired to be in a state and condition of slavery as regards her office as the Mother of my God, in order to honor her more humbly and more holily so high and divine an office. And I give myself to her as a slave in honor of the gift which the Eternal Word has made of himself, and as her sons over the mysteries of the Incarnation that he deigned to bring about in and through her. After defending the vow of slavery to Jesus and Mary, Beroul then probed more deeply into the theology of the Trinity and the mystery of the Incarnation. Beroul's concept of God is pseudo-Dionysian and Platonic, as transmitted by St. Augustine and the Rhineland mystics. He loved to contemplate God in his essence, separated from the world and transcendent, although not as the God of the philosophers, but as the God of divine revelation. He also had the same preference of St. Augustine for considering the divine unity, which for him the principal attribute was God. He saw the Trinity and the unity of God as contrary dialectic moments which are complementary and ontologically simultaneous. The Father is the principle of the life of the Trinity, a source of divinity, but he is at the same time Alpha and Omega. In relation to the incarnate Word, the Father is both Father and Mother. Beroul seldom refers to the Word except in terms of the Incarnation, but when he does, he uses the optimistic terminology, intellectual generation and image of the Father. The Holy Spirit is produced as the substantial love which is the result of the mutual knowledge of the Father and Son. The Incarnation, according to Beroul, is God's chief creative act, and therefore it would seem that it would have occurred even if it had not been necessary for man's redemption. It is a universal and cosmic event which establishes the new order of grace, of which Christ is the principle and the source. We are born of Christ through the grace as he is born of the Father by nature. Christ's fatherhood through grace is a capitulation of all things in God. Terminology of St. Irenaeus, based on the doctrine of St. Paul. Christ is a microcosm, St. Gregory's expression. Christ is the archetype of the entire universe, Platonic expression. When, however, Beroul attempted to delve more deeply into the mystery of the hypostatic union, he was attacked by the Carmelites and by the ex-Oratorian Hersent for maintaining that in the Incarnation the human nature of Christ is united to the divine essence. Here is his argumentation. If the person of the world is united to the humanity, the essence and the subsistence of the Word are united, and this humanity of Jesus Christ our Lord bears and receives in itself not only the personal being, but also the essential being of God. For the Word is God, God is man, and man is God according to the most familiar and most common notions of the faith. And the Word is God by this divine essence, and God is man by this humanity. And man is God by the divinity which the humanity receives in the subsistence of the eternal Word, and it is not possible to understand how this personal being of God can be communicated in the essential being of God. Bernoulli also referred to the Incarnation as a kind of second Trinity, because whereas the first Trinity of subsistence, of unity, and of essence, the second is a Trinity of essence in the unity of subsistence, namely the soul and the body and the divinity of Jesus. The first Trinity is divine and uncreated in its persons and its essence. The second Trinity is divine in the person but human in its two essences. Bernoulli defended himself against his accusers by saying that his doctrine on the hypostatic union was based on the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas. The remaining years of Bernoulli's life were far from peaceful. First of all, he entered into a theological conflict with the Jesuits, whom he accused of neo-paganism. In his view, they granted entirely too much liberty and responsibility to man in the working of justification and salvation, and he wished to follow more closely the teachings of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. Secondly, Bernoulli was himself attacked by Cardinal Richelieu, who ridiculed Bernoulli's spiritual teaching with a great animosity. Nevertheless, in spite of these troubled years, Bernoulli wrote a directory for the superiors of the oratory, a panegyric in honor of St. Mary Magdalene, said to be one of the most beautiful ever written, and a life of Christ. He died at the altar on October 2nd, 1629, while celebrating a votive Mass of the Incarnation. Within 15 years after his death, Bernoulli was almost forgotten, but his spiritual teaching was perpetuated by his disciples, and especially by Bourgogne, who dedicated his entire life to the propagation of Bernoulli's Christocentric teaching. All number of reasons can be given for the brevity of Bernoulli's posthumous influence, but perhaps the principal one is one that he was eclipsed by Condren, Ollier, Bossuet, the most illustrious of them all. Other factors are the destructive criticism by Cardinal Richelieu, the enmity of the Jesuits, the indifference in many oratorians, and the archaic ponderous style of his writing. Nevertheless, one author stated, as it is impossible to read the treatises of St. Augustine without becoming humble, or those of St. Teresa without loving prayer, so also we cannot read those of Cardinal de Bruel without becoming filled with reverence for God and the mysteries of his Son. The foregoing tribute adequately sums up Bernoulli's spirituality, which rests on the foundation of the virtue of religion. It is directed to participation in the mystery of Christ. Starting with an Augustinian view of man's sin and misery, Bernoulli stresses man's need for God. But man also has within himself the imprint of the divine image and a natural desire for God. Only grace through Christ can solve the problem of the tension between man's misery and his desire for God. Thus, two operations are involved in the sanctification of the soul: the work of God in the soul and that of the soul towards God. The first is called grace and the second is called virtue. But grace is intimately linked with the mystery of Christ, because Christ is not the only mediator of grace, but at the very source of grace. Just as the humanity of Christ cannot even exist apart from the divinity of the person of the Word, so also in the spiritual life we cannot live through the life of Christ until we are completely despoiled on self and have put on Christ. Through grace, therefore, a new order is realized in man, and its manifestation is adherence to God through the virtue of religion. For Berulle, participation in the mystery of Christ is not simply imitation of Christ, which would be something purely external. It is a union with Christ's own life and actions, especially Christ's prayer, sentiments in adoration of his Father. The most important Christ-like activity for the Christian is adoration. Only Christ can give the virtue of religion its plenitude as adoration of the Father. Hence, in adhering to Christ, we embrace a spirituality of adoration, an adoration rooted in love, because the God we adore is also our last end, in which we find happiness and peace. In explaining how the Christian soul can participate in the mystery of Christ, Berulle speaks of the mysteries or events of the life of Christ as states. Each ministry or event is at the same time an historical transitory action which is finished and will not be repeated, and also the eternal manifestation of the dispositions and inward feelings of our Lord. The latter is that Berulle meant by state, and it's eternal. It does not change, because it pertains to the incarnation, which is an eternal and unchanging mystery. Three names are of special importance in the development and refinement of Berullian spirituality: Condren, Olier, and St. John Eudes. Bremen states that the concept of adherence to Christ was expressed in different ways by the leaders of the French school. Berulle has a more general adherence, in some way, to the person of the Word incarnate, children by a somewhat more particularized adherence to Christ, dead and rise again. Finally, Olier is an adherence to the most deep, the most religious, most persevering, and consequently most really active and efficacious annihilation of the same Word in the Eucharist. St. John Eudes summarized everything in devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and was the most outstanding promoter of this doctrine in the 17th century. Charles Condren, 1588 to 1641, holds an eminent place among the Oratorians. His personal sanctity was admired by all, but as superior general of the Oratorians he was dilatory in making decisions. Very likely he would have been an unusually successful spiritual writer, but he preferred to dedicate himself to spiritual direction, conferences, and letters. He is much more Augustinian than Berulle in regard to man's sinful and wretched state. Therefore, he is much more pessimistic. His main theme in the spiritual doctrine is that of sacrifice, which would lead the individual to self-annihilation and complete abandonment to God. Yet, sacrifice of self as a victim to God cannot bridge the gap between God's greatness and man's nothingness. This is possible only through the incarnation. Therefore, the humanity of Christ was necessary to offer a fitting sacrifice to God. 3 divine perfections especially make a man conscious of his own nothingness and his need for Christ as priest and victim: God's sanctity, his sovereignty, and his plenitude. Jean-Jacques Euler, 1608-1657, founder of the Seminary of St. Pulpus, has been studied as he deserves, and his written works have not yet been edited completely. He was a person of difficult temperament, and according to some authors he gave signs of mental imbalance, though he is commonly considered an authentic mystic. His best writings were published towards the end of his life, and they became standard works on priestly spirituality. Earlier, however, this teaching manifested like pessimism and exaggerations characteristic of the French school of spirituality. Like Berulle and Condren, his spiritual teaching rests on the 2 themes of self-abnegation and adherence to Christ. Taking his cue from the teachings of St. Paul on the opposition between the flesh and the spirit, Euler maintains that man must annihilate himself so that the Holy Spirit may work in him. Even after baptism, which restores the soul, the flesh remains corrupt. If, therefore, a man follows the inclinations of his body, he can only sin. For that reason he must hate his flesh and never yield in any way to it. Rather, he must love pain, suffering, and persecution. Even the necessary functions such as eating and drinking must be kept to the minimum imposed by necessity. This severe self-abnegation is man's way of expressing the reverence, adoration, and love that comprise the virtue of religion, which has its perfect manifestation in Jesus Christ. Thus, Euler comes to adherence to Christ, the principal theme in the French school, but with an emphasis that is particularly his own. He states, "Our Lord has made me see that, desirous of renewing the primitive spirit of the Church in these days, he raised up 2 persons in order to begin this design: Monseigneur de Berulle, to honor him in his incarnation, and Father Condren, to honor him in the whole of his life, his death, and, above all, in his resurrection. There remains to do him honor after the resurrection and his ascension, as he is in the most august sacrament of the Eucharist. He was filled to bestow upon myself, as a successor to Father de Condren, the grace and spirit of this adorable mystery." According to Euler, the sacred humanity of Christ is annihilated by the incarnation by being deprived of its own personality. It is clothed with divinity and totally consecrated to the Father. In like manner, we should become annihilated in regard to our own interests and self-love, so that we can be clothed with Jesus Christ and in keeping with the mystery of the Incarnation, completely consecrated to the service of God. Olier drew up specific practices for preserving one's conformity with Christ, but he designates the Eucharist as the most effective means of union with Christ, and he notes its importance for the renewal of the clergy. Christ in the Eucharist is the model for all priests and source of all priestly holiness. St. John Eudes, 1601 to 1680, founder of the Congregation of Jesus and Mary and of the Congregation of Our Lady of Charity, a Good Shepherd, and was the first to observe the sacred feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, although he was one of the chief proponents of Berulian spirituality. He avoided the abstract or metaphysical elements in Breuil's writing, preferring to compose a practical manual for the spiritual life of ordinary Christians. Renowned as a preacher and confessor, his special contribution to the Church in France was the renewal of the parish clergy and the foundation of a seminary for the proper formation of candidates for the priesthood. In the Church at large, however, he is most highly regarded as apostles of devotion to Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. Jansenism. Time and again in the history of the Church, the excesses that emerged in Christian spirituality were rooted in the fundamental problem of the relationship between grace and human nature. In France, the traditional doctrine, which state that grace perfects nature, elevates it to a higher level through a participation in the divine life while leaving it intact as human nature, was obscured by a doctrine that either destroyed nature and replaced it with grace, or exalted nature to the point that grace was unnecessary. Jansenism and Quietism, the two excesses that marked the spirituality of the French school, were related to each other in the sense that they both exaggerated the role of grace at the expense of human nature and human effort. In other respects, however, they were poles apart. The upheaval in French spirituality lasted for an entire century, from 1650 to 1750, and the ill effects were felt in the Church until the 20th century. Since theologians and historians have studied these two heretical movements in great depth, it is not necessary to do more than give a cursory survey of the rise and influence of each one. Berulle and his followers, as we have seen, reacted strongly against the humanism by stressing the Augustinian teaching on the baseness and sinfulness of the man and his utter dependence on God in the order of grace. Although the Berullians were unyielding in their opposition to the Jansenists, they may have unwittingly provided some doctrinal leverage for the heretical thrust. Saint Cyran was a great admirer of Berulle, but when the latter died and no oratorian dared to preach the funeral eulogy without risking the wrath of Cardinal Richelieu, Saint Cyran circulated an open letter in which he paid tribute to Berulle. Another factor that contributed to the rise of Jansenism in particular was the effort to combat the errors of Luther and Calvin. To get right to the heart of the difficulty, the humanists decided to soften the Augustinian and Thomistic emphasis on predestination and the gratuity of grace in order to emphasize man's freedom and the necessary cooperation with grace. The reaction was not slow in coming. At Louvain, Michael Bayes, 1589, asserted that the humanists have gone too far. Actually, a man is no longer free after original sin. All he can do is sin until he receives the grace of justification, for which he can do nothing by way of preparation. Leonard Lessius, a Jesuit professor at Louvain, answered Bayes by saying that God from all eternity has determined that grace sufficient to justification be given to those through the merits of Christ, and at the moment that God himself chooses. Sufficient grace becomes efficacious as a result of man's voluntary acceptance, and then, since God foresees man's future merits as a result of grace, he predestines man to further graces and to salvation. In Spain, meanwhile, Dominic Banez, Dominican professor of Salamanca from 1577 until his death in 1604, rallied to the defense of Augustinian and Thomistic doctrine. According to Banez, prior to any consideration of man's merits, God decrees the act of man and the free manner in which man performs those acts. Man, therefore, remains free, but always within the providence of God, for it would be impossible for a man to be so autonomous that he becomes a total cause of his own actions. This would make God dependent on man, or at least as regards the knowledge of man's free actions. In 1588, Luis Molina, Society of Jesus, published his famous Concordia Liberi Arbitri cum Gratia Donis at Lisbon. He proposed an original explanation by which man's freedom could be respected without detracting from the infallibility and universality of God's knowledge and causality. Since the exercise of man's free will is conditioned by a variety of circumstances, God does not know them by his scientiae simplicis intelligensis, which knows things that could never but will exist, nor by his scientiae visionis, which knows those things which God had decreed will definitely exist. The conditioned future acts of man's free will are known by a third type of divine knowledge, which Molina calls scientiae media. From all eternity, God foresees how a man will act in given circumstances, and in view of that knowledge, God offers to man such and such a grace that he sees that man will react to it. The Dominicans strongly attacked the Molinist teaching, but the Roman congregation De Auxiliis Gratiae, 1597, failed to resolve the question, and Molinism enjoyed great popularity until the beginning of the 17th century, when once again the Augustinian teaching comes into favor. This, as we have seen, was aided to a great extent by Beryl and his followers. Jansenism, however, is an exaggeration of St. Augustine's teaching, and the Beryllian French school was vehemently opposed to the excesses of Jansenism. The originators of Jansenist teaching were John du Vergier Haurain, 1581 to 1643, more commonly known as Saint Cyrian because he became abbot there, and Cornelius Jansen, 1585 to 1638, a doctor at Louvain and later Bishop of Ypres. Saint Cyrian and Jansen both felt that humanitarian and Molinism gave so much freedom to man that for all practical purposes they nullified the necessity of the redemption by Christ. So many concessions were made to human nature, especially with the introduction of probabilism and casuity in moral theology, that Christ's moral teaching had become scandalously lax and pagan. Even St. Francis de Sales did not escape their approval. There are in the saints, in the greatest saints, dangerous qualities which are good only for themselves, and which can sometimes be harmful to others who wish to imitate them without having their spirit, grace, and the same blessing of God. Such are the mildnesses of the holy Bishop of Geneva, which made him increase in grace, but which to others could be harmful, evil, either through their own fault, through ignorance and bad tidings of those in charge of them. My Lord of Geneva was a holy man, but he was not one of the apostles, and it is their general rules that we have to follow. Jansen and St. Cyrian proposed as the authentic primitive teaching the following points. Because of original sin, human nature is fundamentally corrupt. Man is totally incapable of choosing between good and evil. Grace alone suffices to necessitate man's actions and choices, and only the elect will be saved, and only the elect can benefit from the redemption. Sacramental absolution is not to be given until the penance has been performed. Perfect contrition is required for absolution from sin. Pure love of God is demanded as a requisite for worthy communion. The primary practice of the Christian life is the performance of penitential acts. St. Cyrian accordingly proposed to abolish the present state of the Church. He declared that God intended to bring down the existing church in ruin, but to put a renewed church in place, and Jansen took upon himself to reform the doctrine, while Anthony Arnauld was to re-establish the practices of the past. Both worked under the inspiration of St. Cyrian. It is generally recognized by historians that Jansen and St. Cyrian together initiated the movement of religious reform, and that the latter, himself already Calvinized, infected with his heretical poison, the future author of Augustinus. Under the pretext of making Christians more worthy of God's love and mercy, the Jansenists alienated them from God by inculcating a fear that bordered on despair and a penitential spirit that violated the fundamental laws of charity and piety. Preoccupied as they were with man's need for grace and his inability to do anything to dispose himself for it, they distorted Christianity into a religion of pessimism and scrupulosity. At the same time, their preoccupation with self soon evolved into a consummate pride and egotism, especially evident in Saint Cyrian and Mother Angelique. The result of all this was a spirituality of dour moralism, which haughtily cut itself off from the mainstream of Catholic life. As Knox put it, overlooked in its cradle by the mournful faces of Saint Cyrian and Mother Angelique, Jansenism never learned to smile. Its adherents forget, after all, to believe in grace, so hag-ridden as they are by their senses of the need for it. Although the number of Jansenists were relatively small and centered for the most part in the convent of Port Royal, the spirit of Jansenism lived on after its death. Various reasons can be given for the stubbornness of the heresy. First, the Friends of Point Royal were persons of high position in the Church, Bishops Arnold, Colbert, and Noailles. The royal court, the Duchess of Longueville, and literary circles, Pascal, Racine, Madame de Sévigné. Secondly, the tardiness with which Richelieu took action against Saint Cyrian, and thirdly, the clumsy effort of the French Jesuits to halt the movement. Ultimately, however, Jansen ended its tragic course. It had started with the desire to restore the purity of primitive Christian doctrine and practice. Almost immediately it became involved in the argument over grace and human freedom. Then it manifested itself as a self-conscious asceticism that became increasingly puritanical, and finally it enclosed itself in total separation from the world and from the rest of Christianity by a futile attempt to restore the eremitical life, as if to set up a little church within the church. The death blow was dealt by Pope Clement XI, who issued the bull Unigenitus, in condemnation of more than 100 propositions excerpted from the work Reflexions Morales by the ex-Oratorian Quesnel. Many French clergy refused to accept the decree of the Pope, and in 1718 another bull, Pastoralis Officii, excommunicated all who refused to yield.